Welcome to Viewpoints. I'm Heather Isvaron, and with me today is Dan O'Connor, Director of Field Operations for the Chief Security Officer at FEMA. Welcome, Dan.
Welcome, Heather. Thank you.
So we want to talk today about resilience. And specifically, there's so much talk about it, and frankly, there's so much information about it. What can our local, state, tribal, territorial, and federal officials do to be more resilient? Let's define it first.
Well, I think when you try to define a word that's overused and has so many different variables, you have to understand that many things can happen, but not all of them do. So there's an element of risk management to resilience. There is an element of resources, and being able to both effectively lead and manage a group of people or an organization against something that could be a regular occurrence or catastrophic. The challenge is finding the balance point or the homeostasis of the Department of Homeland Security and a Homeland Security infrastructure or enterprise that best prepares and responds for things that are likely to happen, and also build a cadre or a coterie of people that adapt successfully and effectively to things that you can't plan for, things that are not likely to happen, those black swans that will affect all of us across the country.
So I'm going to use another overused word, our word, risk. So risk and resilience, is that part of your definition as well?
I think so, because without consequence, there's no risk. So anytime you start talking about risk and mitigation in the security realm, in the emergency management realm, in the consequence management realm, you have to understand that there's no risk without consequence. So at some level, you have to be able to quantify, because we live in a quantified world, how you're going to best put finite resources, finite activity, finite personnel against something that potentially is infinite. So understanding some components of risk will better allow you to understand what you might call as resilience, what you might call capability, what you might call anti-fragile, are all elements of understanding how to best adapt and provide a response to an incident.
We'll get to the anti-fragile a little later, but can you give me an example of something that might be infinite in terms of resilience?
Well, in terms of infinity, like I opened with, there are a million things that can happen, but the likelihood of them happening is very small. There are incidents that have happened that were before our lifetime. The Mississippi River flowing backwards, Krakatoa blowing up, those kind of things. The Cascadia event that we recently tried to exercise in terms of a catastrophic earthquake on the Pacific Northwest. Those things are maybe not necessarily likely, but you have to have some idea of how you would like to respond, but you cannot exercise your response because you don't know the magnitude of the activity. So not knowing what you don't know, you have to build a reservoir of abilities, capabilities, ideas, people who can best adapt quickly to a situation that exercises resource management in a terse fiscal environment, exercises decision making in a very critical time frame in a short time.
Let's stop right there about the resilient decision making. Can you expand on that particular point a bit?
Well, from my point of view, and some of the experiences I have had, is you have to decentralize authority for people to exercise profound, provocative, and dynamic decision making. So you have to push to the lowest level possible the ability for a leader to make a sound and timely decision without having the Monday morning quarterback, the after effects, the totalitarian hierarchy of trying to make decisions, because the incident moves on at its regular time. The incident on paper doesn't, so you create gaps. And in those gaps, you allow people to be second guessers. And in these situations, there's no time for second guessing because lives are at stake.
But how do you build capabilities in a person to make those decisions in terms of teaching them how to be better at making resilient decisions?
I think you teach people how to make resilient decisions based on how you train and educate them. So training is a methodology for what you know. Education is a methodology for what you don't know. So you have a routinized behavior that you train. In my previous experience as a Marine, you have behaviors that you want to instill for immediate action, if then, consequences. If something happens, then that. And you can have that at a variety of level of performance, law enforcement, fire service, emergency management, those kind of things have a threshold where they understand what they see, they do. It's when you get past that normal behavior, when you start getting what's called novelty, things that are new, that are emergent, that you can't train for, that you cannot necessarily explain, that your leaders and your behavior has to adapt to the situation quickly and make sound and timely decisions. How you do that is to expose people to a variety of frictions under a controlled situation, perhaps even call it a laboratory, but expose people to some forms of controlled duress so they can make decisions under pressure but not have consequence to that pressure. And people become more adaptive when they are stressed and friction is applied to show that there could be a variety of responses to a single situation. There is no best answer in crisis.
Well, that's a really good way to put it. Let's get to that anti-fragile notion that you have about whether it's an individual or communities. Explain that a little bit.
Well, antifragility is not my term. It's a term by an author, Mr. Talib. He is the father of the black swan phenomenon, wrote several books, but I think there's a theme in his writing and his explanation that resilience isn't a great response to what we're trying to do because it doesn't have a counter. So in a society that has, to a degree of excess, we have expectations of our infrastructure, our systems, our food systems. They're a series of monocultures. And we spend a lot of time and energy and resources maintaining our monoculture. Antifragility would introduce or entertain the possibility of having a polyculture, which means a series of systems that are highly adaptive and actually respond favorably to risk. But when you get into the term of anti-fragile, the antithesis to fragile, it becomes a little difficult to explain because it's counter to the emergency management and Homeland Security narrative that we, as a nation and our culture, tend to spend far more time in the response mode than we do in the preparedness and preparation mode. And you see that how we treat our infrastructure, how we treat our investment portfolio, how we as a culture are very immediate. And sometimes, with an anti-fragile point of view, our inability to delay our gratification actually makes us more vulnerable to incidences and crises that may not be crises if we came at it at a different point of view.
Let's go back to the monoculture and the polyculture. Can you describe each of those and give an example of how that works?
I think the best example I can give would be to go back to what's termed the Irish potato famine, the Great Hunger. The reason the potato famine decimated the Irish was because they had one food source, the potato. Once that potato was affected by the blight and it wiped out their food source, they were effectively starved to death. The same blight that affected that potato in Ireland did not have the same effect in Peru. Peru had multiple variants of potatoes, 30 or 40 variants. And while the one white potato was wiped out, the rest of the potatoes that were still a primary staple in their food culture survived, and they did not lose 50% of their population to death and immigration. Therefore, adding resilience to a system, multiple variants of a product or a culture of food or a system, having more variety lets cultures or people or systems have some avenues of adaptation.
Okay, and you know this isn't my area of expertise, but what if you put that over to use like the internet as an example? You have one internet, right? But you have lots of different ways to use it. How can you make that more resilient?
Well, I think not being an internet or a cyber expert with some latent background, you have to have a network that's able to adapt and heal itself, identify the risks, identify the threats, respond to the threats, perhaps without the introduction of a man-made requirement. You know, a system adapts. It's usually the injection of man's activity that makes systems fails. For example, the two that come to my mind immediately are both Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. The systems responded accordingly. It was the introduction of man's activity, the supervisors who refused or did not comply with the system interface, that caused both of those meltdowns. So systems tend to be built to perform at a pretty high degree of efficiency, and they're very tightly coupled, so there's not a lot of margin. The unintended consequence of the system and also the introduction of man-made activity can have or yield unintended consequences, and those are some of the things that are considered black swans or that you can't prepare for and you have to adapt to quickly.
And let's go deeper into the expectations and more of the anti-fragility mindset. How can that become more pervasive in our culture?
Well, I think anytime you reflect back to your ability to adapt, you have to simplify. And we love complexity. We have a very complex logistics system that delivers our food, our water, our gasoline, and you can have an interruption somewhere along that system that can potentially have exponential crisis. So if you have a hole or a break in a pipeline in southwest Georgia, it affects the fuel prices and delivery system all the way up to Maine. So we're very tightly coupled and it's very complex. We like complexity because it's cost efficient. It allows us to have a great way of life, a surplus of activity and product, but at the same time, we don't invest in making it more robust, the ability to adapt, resilient. So if you want to make things resilient, oftentimes you have to simplify them and reduce your expectation. And it doesn't mean necessarily make things less effective, less excellent, but it's looking at things a different way. You can travel in a variety of ways. You can eat in a variety of ways. You can secure yourself in a variety of ways. If you constantly focus on the one threat or the one food system or the one energy system, you are prone to reinforce that behavior and it makes you less resilient. If you consistently focus on one energy system, petroleum, if you focus on one food system, corn, if you focus on one behavior constantly and reinforce that behavior constantly and neglect other probabilities and potentialities, you make yourself less resilient.
Well, I also think you do that because you do have so many choices, right? You can tailor anything to your news feed, your shopping tastes, anything towards what you prefer. And you get used to that because it's so convenient. And I think that's where we get off the rails as a culture. We just are not used to not having that anymore.
Well, those are all orchestrated behaviors, so it's interesting that you bring that up. There's a lot of theory and some literature out there that says that our amount of choice and the variety of choice actually cripples us because we can't make decisions because we've been given too many opportunities. When you have 43 different kinds of ketchup and 70 different kinds of mustard and 65 different kinds of peanut butter, is too much, and you cripple your ability to make decisions because the expectation is that you're always seeking the best. In most instances, in a security perspective, in a military perspective, in a life perspective, sometimes, oftentimes, good enough is good enough. And just because you have choice doesn't mean it's excellent choice.
Right. Well, I think that's really the battle because we don't want to lose our choices. We think of that in our culture as losing power or losing what we're accustomed to. And so it would be interesting to see our culture dial back their expectations a bit in order to be more resilient. It doesn't seem very likely that that's going to happen because all we're moving towards is more choices.
Well, and I think that's it's a behavior that has been orchestrated from economic engines. The more variety that is introduced into the system, whether it's in automobiles, energy, food, there has to be some type of return on revenue. So you have it's a really interesting paradigm. You know, our economic system and how we generate revenue affects every decision we make, consciously and subconsciously. So the car you buy, the roads you drive, the clothes you wear, may not necessarily be as much as a choice you make, but a choice that has been designed for you to make in order to force a certain behavior. All of these things can undermine independent action, and independent action is an element of being antifragile and resilient.
I think that's really where we got back to in the circle of the discussion is we are so used to having things and stuff and choices that when they're taken away all of a sudden, and it will happen at some point in our lives, how then should we react?
So there's 2 points of view I'd like to share with you in that. We don't know if it's going to happen in our lifetime. That's one of the challenges. Many things can happen, few do. I think you can carefully remove yourself from the emotionalism of holiday seasons and look at what's currently going on in Venezuela, where they are rioting for food, and where recently we saw riots over TV sets at Walmart. So when you condition people to have a certain behavior and have an expectation that they are getting a deal, or if they don't get this deal, that they're losing out, you are tapping into the innate human behavior to survive. And instead of fighting for food and water, we are fighting over Gatorade and plasma TVs. So that's a great indicator of the surplus and greatness that our country's been able to generate. It also is one of our greatest Achilles heels, that we have grown to have an expectation of everything all the time. And when or if that is interrupted, that'll be a really critical challenge for our leaders and managers who have to recalibrate the expectations of the American population.
I think that's really our biggest job, is to slowly and surely do that, to take those expectations and dial them back a bit. Otherwise, we're in for a really rude awakening.
Well, there's an expectation, see, and the expectation is we will always have more. Where did that come from? I can't say. The United States has been very fortunate for a variety of reasons and a variety of methodologies, and part of resilience, part of anti-fragility, part of understanding the management and expectation of debt. If we live past our means and we create a dire situation where we can no longer pay for what our expectation is, that's also a criticality that we may really have a difficult time overcoming if and when an interruption occurs.
I really appreciate your perspective today. Thank you so much for joining us.
That was my pleasure. Thank you.